Amen. After the lady sang, I wanted to just jump up and say, come on in, boys, the water's fine. This morning, as we look into God's Word, we're going to look into the book of Judges, and it's going to be several, probably the longest passage about a judge in the book of Judges, about Gideon. But I want to start with Hebrews chapter 11, and this is sort of a working definition of faith. But it says in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And then verse 2 says, for by it the men of old gained approval. And then it starts just listing the great men of faith. It starts off by saying, by faith, Abel offered a greater offering, a better offering to God than Cain. And said, though he is dead, now his testimony still is preached, is still shared because of faith. And by faith, Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for he was taken. Verse 6, he says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And then it just continues in that explanation, those examples. By faith, Noah and Abraham had spent some time, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and is Joseph blessed, and then Moses. And then it moves through that time and speaks about the time they're brought out of slavery and bondage, and goes into even when they go to the promised land. And by faith the walls of Jericho came down, and by faith Rahab the harlot that was there, that her life was spared. Let's move down to verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. As we're going to look at Gideon, you can hear these words in the book of Hebrews and stand on this side of history and look back, and you see a man who has a man of faith. He is a man that has put armies to flight. He's a man who was from weakness made strong. He was a man who became mighty in war. From this side of history, that's what we see. But if you go back to the details, that is not what he started out to be. He started out to be a man who was a doubter, and that God turned him into a man of faith. And so because God changed him, then we can look back and see the testimony to the glory of God. But I want us to examine this man who was a complainer in Judges chapter 6. As God moves him and is patient with him, he leads him to defeat the Midianites in chapter 7, so he becomes a conqueror. And then in chapter 8, the first part of that, he's dealing with some pride issues in the Ephraimites and all the different tribes. And you can just hear that he becomes a man of wise counsel. So God can take a complainer, even a coward, and God can take us and he can give us the victory. He can make us conquerors, and he can give us wisdom to live our life to where we are a benefit and ministry to other people. So let's look at that story. Now, as we get into this story, think of if you had a garden and you had put your time and sweat and money, and you raised and you depended upon that garden. You raised everything that your family was going to eat. And then your neighbor came in and they beat you up and they took the produce out of your garden. And what they didn't take, they ruined. How would you feel about that? And then what if they did that year after year? Because we come into leading into the 8th year. This has gone on for 7 years. But we're told the real story about that in Judges chapter 6. So let's look there. Judges chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1. And we're going to hear the question from the heart of Gideon. Does God keep his promises? And some of us right now in this church family, we're all hurting. Miss Marty's lost her mom just right after her dad. I said her dad didn't have to wait long for her. The Kendrick family, in just such a time of turmoil, because we're glad to see Miss Alice healed, but it just hurts our heart. You've only got one mama, only one wife, and then baby Briggs. And it is just heart-wrenching. And I cannot help but ask, why? I can't help but ask, does God keep his promises? And so this morning, this is for us, for the church family. But this is for me. So if you don't need it, just listen, maybe you'll gain something. Judges chapter 6 and verse 1, then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hands of the Midianites 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and in the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey. And they would come up with their livestock and their tents, and come up in the like locusts for number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to devastate it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to God. If you will remember, the reason that they are in this mess that they're in is because they sinned against God. And they continued. God would send them prophets, and God would tell them what to do, and God would demonstrate his love and his graciousness toward them, and they would not change. They would not repent. So God sends the Midianites to be able to discipline them. And if they would learn the lesson is for God's people to learn that lesson, to listen to his word. And whenever we don't, then we forget the blessings that God has brought us. They had forgotten the promise. There's a prophet who comes and says, we're the ones that God brought out of Egypt. We're the ones that God gave us this promised land, and he depossessed it from those who were here, and God gave us this. And yet we have turned our back, and we have worshiped Baal, and we have done all these things that God has told us not to do. And God has been patient and patient and patient until finally God says, you've got to learn a lesson. And he brings discipline upon them. And so as you come to the end of verse 6, it says, but you would not obey me. Even in all of his goodness, you would not obey me. Pick up in verse 11. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak. Let me pause there for just a second. The angel of the Lord, that's an expression, the messenger of Yahweh, the announcer of Yahweh. But as we see, that's the same terminology that was used whenever God came and was speaking to Moses. I believe this is a pre-incarnate visit of Christ. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. Get the picture here. He's in a winepress below the surface level, and he's getting just enough that for his family. And every once in a while, you ever seen those meerkats in the desert, and they'll pop their head up? That's a picture I get of Gideon. He is afraid of the Midianites, and he is just trying to get enough food to last for his family. And verse 12, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. It's an odd term to use right now. Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us. He's given us into the hands of Midian. And the Lord looked at him and said, Go in your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? You don't have to depend upon yourself. This isn't up to you. Have I not sent you? So it begs that question. And he's asking the question, does God really care? And sometimes we all let ourselves ask that question, does God really care? But I want to remind you that the reason that all that we experience is because Adam and Eve made a choice in the garden, and they chose to sin. And we are all sinners. And because of that, there are consequences to sin. And those consequences are all the pain and the agony of living this life with briars and labor in a way that's not fulfilling, and the most joyous occasions of life to be filled with pain. That's all a result of Adam and Eve's sin, of our sin. The Israelites are in the midst of this time of sorrow and disappointment and fear because of their sin. It is not that God is being mean to us or that God doesn't care for us. He is bringing them to the point so that the children of God will listen to the word of God. And so God continues to warn them, and Gideon was told that God's going to use him, and Gideon's about to deny it and begins to make excuses. God says, you go, have I not delivered them into your hand? I am saying this to you. It's dependent upon me. And Gideon says, as most of us do, whenever we ask that question, does God really care? And God begins to convict our heart in such a way that he puts it back for us to deal with, then Gideon stepped back and said, whoa, wait a minute. Calling me? No. See, my tribe is the least of all the tribes. Of all the 12 tribes, our tribe's right down here. And then as far as my tribe is, my daddy's house, we're not real prominent around here. We're at the bottom of the rung. And in my daddy's house, I'm the youngest one. I'm the least qualified person for you to call to do this. I just cannot do this. And so that begs the second question. Does God really know what he's doing? Don't call me to do it. I'm not qualified to do it. But I'm here to tell you, God doesn't call the qualified. He calls those whom he calls, and then he equips them. And so as he does, he starts out with that old valiant warrior, and I can almost hear Gideon go, valiant warrior? Gideon didn't want to do it. But God's commands are always God's enablements. He always, if he calls us, he always equips us. It is by his grace, and his grace is sufficient. What does sufficient mean? In your mind, what does sufficient mean? If you eat a meal and you say, well, that was sufficient, that means it was enough. But sometimes it means that is just enough. Now, if you're dependent upon something and it's of great importance to you, then just enough is fine. If I've got just enough of my head above water that I can breathe, then I'm going to be okay. If I've got just enough time to get something done, then I'm going to be okay. But most of us want enough and plenty. And when we have plenty, it seems like we're no better than the Israelites. When we have plenty, we forget who gave it to us. And somehow we start patting ourselves on the back and thinking that we can do this, or we did this. You didn't see yourself through this. God sees you through this. And we're in this mess because we have all sinned. And sin brings consequences. But God chose not to leave us there. And so whenever he begs that question, God warns him, and God brings him, God commands him, and he says, it's I who have called you. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now Gideon does something. What Gideon is known for is asking for signs. And so he asks for a sign here. I'm going to tell you, and I'll deal with this in just a minute, but asking for signs for God is a bad idea. It is not a faith. It is not biblical to ask God of signs. Matter of fact, whenever the devil was tempting Jesus, Jesus said, you're not supposed to try to test God. He's going to meet the test, but if God does anything, he does it out of his grace. And he demonstrates that to Gideon. Gideon said, I need a sign. And so, wait right here. Don't move. And he runs back to the house and he fixes goat. That doesn't sound very appetizing to you maybe, but that was a delicacy. They love that, and some unleavened bread and some soup. And he comes back, and the angel of the Lord, or the pre-incarnate Christ, was still sitting there. And he says, here, I've made you a meal with some meat and some bread and some broth. And he said, lay the meat and the bread on the stone and pour the broth out. And then he reaches out with his staff and he consumes it in fire. Now, I don't know about you, but fire of the Lord just doesn't seem like something I want to be much around. The fire of the Lord, and then all of a sudden he vanished. And Gideon, if he had would you have any doubt at this point? Whenever he has asked for a sign and God has made it so sure. Now, this is what God told him to do. I do care for you. I want you to go, because for Gideon to do what God's about to tell him to do, he's going to have to go against his family and all of his village and all of his neighbors. This is a test of faith. So God's testing him. He said, I want you to go and I want you to tear down the altar of Baal, and I want you to take the Asherah, the wooden, like a totem pole, and I want you to use, that's made of wood, cut it down, use that wood, go get your daddy's prize bull, and then get another bull, 7 years old, bring your daddy's prize bull out here and offer it as a sacrifice to me. And it says that Gideon decided he was going to do it, but he was afraid of his neighbors. So he didn't do it during the daytime. He went and did it, but he did it in secret. He did it at nighttime. Well, the next morning, whenever all his neighbors came out and said, what has happened here? Who did this? And, well, you kind of need to know, too, about what they believed. Now, let me say, this may seem odd to us, but this was prevalent. This was the land of Canaan. This was the gods of Canaan that they worshiped. Baal was the god of the storm god. He was the god of fertility. And so he was sort of the main character. But Asherah was, or in some, she's called Anat, was his sister. And she was the goddess of war. And then Mot was the god of death. He was kind of a lesser god in their system. And what happened is that Mot, the god of death, that he takes Baal. And Asherah is so angry over it, the goddess of war, that she kills Mot. And then Baal is resurrected from the dead. And then Baal and Asherah, his sister, have sex. Everybody say, ooh, ooh. And whenever you think of that, then they see that as the worship of fertility. And that's why in the Baal temples, why there was so much just immorality. There were prostitutes who they paid money to, and whenever they would go in to the prostitute, both male and female, they would that would be an act of worship to Baal. So that's why Baal, and they did horrible things, the mistreatment of children and the murder of babies. So you see how horrible it is. Well, all of his neighbors, including his own dad, worshiped Baal, had an altar to Baal, had an Asherah. God said, we're finished with this. Tear down that altar, tear down the Asherah, cut it down, build an altar for me, burn the wood with Asherah, and offer your dad's prize bull. And so whenever he did it, and they came out and said, who did this? And they asked around, they said, Gideon did it. So they came to Joash's house and said, Send your son out here because he's done this thing and we're going to kill him. And his dad steps up and defends him. He said, if Baal is a god, then why are you contending with my son? If it's Baal's altar, he's done it, then why don't you contend with Baal? And he changed his name, or gave him a nickname, I guess, one who contends with Baal. So as they take place with that, Gideon's lesson is here to learn something. And it is our lesson to learn. God does care. But God is asking us to learn the lesson of listening to him, even when we're afraid, for us to obey his commandments. And when we do, God takes over. And God gives to us that supernatural ability to understand, and he gets glory for that. And so now he comes to the place to ask the third question, or the fourth question. Does God keep his promises? You know the rest of the story. He gets ready to go out, and the estimate of the Midianites is 135,000. That's how many troops were there. So Gideon puts out the call, and men come from all the different tribes, and they gather together, and they've got a fighting force of 32,000. And God says to Gideon, no, that's too many. And Gideon says, now, Lord, if you're calling us to do this, 32,000 against 135,000, Lord, I'm going to ask for another sign. Please don't be mad at me. And so here's where's the laying of the fleece. So he takes a fleece of wool and he lays it out on the threshing floor, and he says, now, God, if you're calling me to do this, then God, make the fleece, when the dew falls, make it fall on the fleece, and then make the floor around it all dry. He came out the next morning, the floor's dry. He picks up the fleece and he wrings out a bowl full. God's calling him. And then he says, Lord, let me make sure. If you're calling me, I'm going to lay this fleece out again. And in the morning when I come out, I'm asking for all the ground around it to be wet with dew, but the fleece to be dry. Next morning he came out, and that's how it was. Isn't God patient? So if you're here this morning and you're thinking, I don't have a shot. God can't keep his promises to me because of all that I've done. I just don't know that I even believe in you. I fear. I have too much fear. I don't know what my family's going to do. What will everybody think? Listen, God is patient, but he's here. And he's calling. Are we going to listen? Doing this, laying out the fleece, don't do that. Don't say, God, I'll do this if you do. That is a lack of faith, and that is disobedience. That is not for us to say, God, I'll do for you when you've done for me. God has done for you. He sent his son to die on the cross. He paid for your sin, and he gave you forgiveness as you have trusted him. Don't ask God for a sign. God has given you the greatest sign of his loyalty and love and patience and grace than you could ever ask for. As Gideon gathers the fighting crew, he's got 32,000 against 135,000. God said that's too many. If you go 32,000 against 135,000, they're going to say, well, yeah, but those 32, man, those were valiant men. Look at them. They whipped 135,000. I don't want the glory to go to y'all. The glory's going to go to me. They're going to know that I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt, gave you the promised land, and whipped the Midianites. So you just turn to them and give an announcement. Can I have everybody's attention? If you're afraid, it's okay. Pack up your stuff and go on home. I've often wondered if I came to a sermon at this point and said, okay, everybody who's ready for the sermon to end, just get up and go walk out, what the percentages would be. For Gideon, he went from 32,000 down to 10,000. 10,000 against 135,000. I mean, who would say, yeah, but those 10,000? No. And he said, so I'm going to give you another test. The men who I say can't go, can't go. Take them down to the water and watch them drink. So they came down to the water, and the ones who got down on all fours and put their face in and drank that way, or even kneeled down and drank that way, then he said, send them home. But the ones who come to the water and they stay alert, they lap out of their hand, those are the ones. And militarily, that's genius, because if you're preparing for battle and you got your face stuck in the water, you're not prepared for battle. If the enemy were to approach at that time, battle would be over, and your face may never come out of the water. But if you are alert, those are the men you want with you in battle. And there were 300. 300 against 135,000, then there's no doubt the Lord's going to have to do it. Are your odds about like that this morning? Then there's no doubt God's going to have to do it. So they go in, and Gideon divides them up, 100, 100, 100. And they get at different stations, and he gives them all a trumpet. And he gives them a lantern and a vase. And so they've got here, here, and here, 100 around. And Gideon's afraid. So another part of the story is that God tells him, go down and listen to one of the camps. And they get down there, and he's listening under surveillance. And one of them said, man, I had a dream last night, and I dreamed that we got whipped. And the other one said, well, that's because it's Gideon and his army. So there's already fear, but whenever Gideon heard that, he knew. He finally knew. So he went back and he set up this arrangement, and they all blew their trumpets. They all threw down. And just think about if that was coming in stereo around you and you heard 300 trumpets, because usually it was only one trumpet per 100 people or so. And they would use different bugle calls, if you would, to know what to do during battle. If you heard 300 trumpets and you're thinking, my goodness, this is huge. We're about to get, and all of a sudden they get into commotion, and then they start running into each other's swords, and they start running, and they're routed. The story goes on that Gideon chases them, and in the chase that he stops at a couple of villages and asks for bread for his 300 men, and those villages wouldn't give it to him. So they go and they finally capture the kings and bring them back and dispose of them. And then they go back to those villages and they get some vines and some briars, and they literally, it says, we're going to teach you a lesson. And those men of great valor were able to come back and say, it wasn't me, it was God. I can stand here today and say, it's not me, it's God. And yes, God cares. And yes, God keeps his promises. He never fails. When he told Gideon, I want you to go in, and I want you, oh man of valor, to go because I've told you to go. This battle's mine. And I'm here to tell you, God has never lost a battle. Not one. So if you are sitting here this morning with a stone heart, if that's your enemy, then right now you declare that to be Jericho. And you let that come tumbling down. And surrender to a God who has never lost. Yesterday, Brother Chris texted several of us about a song that was on his heart, and it just sort of overwhelmed me because I knew what I was going to preach, and it speaks the truth that in battle, that it's not in our hands, it's in God's, and He's never lost. Listen to the words of this song and be encouraged.
miracles when you move, such an easy thing for you to do. And your hand is moving right now. You are still showing up at the tomb of every Lazarus. And your voice is calling me out right now. I know you're able, and my God, come through again. You can do all things. You can do all things but fail, 'cause you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. And I know you never will. Everything's possible by the power of the Holy Ghost. A new wind is blowing right now, breaking my heart of stone, taking over like it's Jericho. And my walls are all crashing down right now. I know you're able, and my God, come through again. You can do all things. You can do all things but fail, 'cause you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. And I know you never will. You can do all things. You can do all things but fail, 'cause you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. And I know you never will, 'cause you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. You never will. Oh, you never lost a battle. You never lost a battle. You never lost a battle. Never, never. You can do all things. You can do all things but fail, 'cause you never lost a battle. No, you never lost a battle. And I know you never will. And I know you never will. I know you never will.
Thank you, Joshua. Never lost a battle, and he never will. Isn't the question this morning, is God able? It's a question, are you willing? Am I willing to listen to him?